Okay, welcome everyone to our next session of the afternoon, actually. I feel like there is going to be a lot of synergy and lessons that we can take out of our keynote session that our next speaker will really help us build on. So thanks again to Tiffany, G, and Sarah for starting us off with a really powerful and helpful session. The session that we're currently in is called People Mainstreaming, Planning Through the Lens of Individual Experiences. I was introduced at the beginning, but just as a reminder, I'm Megan Tuttle, and I am one of the conference co-chairs. I'm happy to introduce Katie Lamb, who is a transportation planner at the North Country Council Regional Commission in Littleton, New Hampshire. She has worked as both in both the US and the UK as a planner, and has helped deliver large development schemes within London, as well as provide technical assistance to local authorities in New York and New Hampshire. While studying at the University of Westminster in London, Katie conducted her thesis research on the public transport system, which is what brings her here to us today, actually. Building upon those opening thoughts that we heard in our keynote session, Katie will share some of her findings about her research on London's transportation system. Specifically, she's going to talk to us about her analysis of the shortcomings of the tools that form the basis of many transportation planning decisions for the city. She's going to introduce us to the concept of people mainstreaming, which is something that's informing her thinking about how to practice planning in a way that looks at and considers the implications of plans and policies on people's individual experiences, which is something we really heard our keynotes talk about a lot. And something that I'm really excited about is Katie is actually going to engage us in an interactive exercise as part of her session. So we hope that you will enjoy both the information that she's going to share with us and enjoy participating in the activity that she has for all of you as well. So Katie, why don't you go ahead?
Excellent. Thanks for the introduction, Megan. And I really am surprised that I had no idea what the keynote speakers are going to say, and there's a lot of overlap, and I swear we did not coordinate at all. So I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to start off by covering a few definitions that I'll be using throughout my presentation. Mobility and accessibility are often used interchangeably, but there's an important distinction between the two. Mobility is the ability to move around and get places. This means, are you able to get from A to B? Whereas accessibility is the ease of that movement and the quality of that time spent. In other words, what is your journey like from A to B? Does it require a detour? Does it cost too much? Will you require assistance? Accommodating is the act of adjusting to a normal when it's necessary. Mainstreaming is the practice of integrating and normalizing individual needs. And I will dive deeper into both of these later on in the presentation. So through my work as a transportation planner in London, I noticed that the method for rating the accessibility of a location was the same whether the station had an elevator available or if it was only accessible by stairs. So for instance, these two stations pictured would be given the same exact weight and accessibility under this method. This method is known as the Public Transport Accessibility Level, or PTAL, and is set by the governing body for the transportation network in London, Transport for London. It has a scale from 0 to 6B, with the 0 being a hashed, and 6 being the dark red. It is used for planning applications to determine parking maximums and the level of cycle parking the developer needs to provide. This rating also affects property values, similar how property values may be affected by transit-oriented developments. So there have been some limitations of the method recognized by Transport for London, such as the ability to board, meaning your ability to get on at peak times when the platform is too busy. Service usefulness, meaning you could live nearby services, stations, but they may not necessarily suit your wants or needs. And lastly, the speed and reliability of the services. As part of my research, I reviewed prior studies that looked at the experiences of those with mobility challenges and found similar threads throughout the literature. Those who have trouble accessing transportation experience greater levels of social exclusion, have restrictions in their choice of housing, employment, and leisure, all of which have an overall negative impact on quality of life. So who is being affected by this method? First off, we have anyone who has mobility challenge and requires step-free access. Next, we have an elderly population, which recent research has shown we are currently in an aging society, meaning there will be a greater cohort of elderly people in the coming decades. And lastly, we have others to consider, such as mothers with children, people with large luggage, blue-collar workers with heavy toolkits, as well as those with temporary injuries such as casts or crutches. The Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit sorts disabilities into 3 categories. Permanent, meaning people who have long-term or lifetime disabilities, such as someone with an assistive device. Temporary, meaning people who have short-term disabilities, such as a broken leg. And situational, which result from an accessory or outside factor, such as a mother with a stroller. So here's the London Underground map as it is advertised, with each dot representing a station. Now this is that same map reflecting only the stations with full accessibility. You can see between these 2 maps just how big of a disadvantage those needing step-free access are at. Also, as part of my research, I conducted site visits to observe how stations of varying accessibility worked and how people use those spaces. I observed a greater diversity in types of riders at accessible stations, as well as the accessible design features such as elevators and level boarding being a benefit to everyone. And as expected, there was a lot more negative observations. So I noticed a lack of clarity and consistency in what step-free means. This laundry list of instructions is meant to clarify those discrepancies. There was also confusing and irregular signage. This picture I snapped at the top here could lead a rider to believe they would not be able to access the Jubilee line if they needed the elevator. I did not see a manual boarding ramp being used once, which I will go into more in a few slides from now. Lastly, the level boarding areas were typically found on only small portions of the platform, meaning the rider would need to locate those particular sections, as well as know if their destination had level boarding in the same exact location. My response to this method was to remove all stations from the calculation that are not fully and truly accessible. To keep with the same sounding abbreviation, I chose PTAL with 2 T's, which adds the word true to the title to make distinction between the former, which does not reflect true accessibility. By making this change to the method, I calculated a 16% job loss on average across the city, with some locations experiencing as much as 50 or 60% loss. I also noticed that the residential locations suffered the most from this method revision. However, by revising this method, there's more exclusiveness incorporated into the planning process, which in turn can lead to a more equitable transportation network. So now I'm going to run through the difference between accommodating and mainstreaming design, the concepts of accommodating and mainstreaming, using the example of boarding the underground. So on the left, under accommodating, we see a manual ramp being employed. And on the right, under mainstreaming, we see a platform with level boarding. So accommodating views the needs of some users as adaptations to the normal. You can see the ramp here is an adaptation to how people would normally use it. Whereas mainstreaming normalizes the needs of all users and doesn't see anyone as different. With the level boarding, everyone can use it. Accommodating incorporates and includes the needs of people only when it is required. So that ramp there is only used when it's required, and it's just left to the side when it's not being used. Whereas mainstreaming incorporates and includes the needs of people from the beginning. So some of the ways you can notice these differences is there's identifiable structural differences between user needs. For mainstreaming, the infrastructure just meets the needs of everyone. In accommodating, and this is a very important part, is attention is drawn to the users needing the accommodations. Mainstreaming, no attention is drawn. And lastly, accommodating lacks permanence and integration. So this manual boarding ramp, it has to be handled by one of the operators. It's not fully integrated into the system. It's just kind of a very clunky aspect. Whereas if it's mainstreamed, it's fully integrated in a permanent structure. So a technology example of accommodating mainstream is Zoom and Google Meet for those who are deaf or hard of hearing. Zoom's closed captioning feature requires someone within the meeting to manually transcribe the speaker's words. This means if you're someone who needs closed captioning to participate, you must contact the host ahead of time and request this, as well as the host has to be able to accommodate this need. It is clear that this is an accommodation because it draws attention to the user and is not a permanent or integrated feature. Google Meet, on the other hand, is a one-click closed captioning option, which also identifies the speaker and shows multiple lines at once, making it even more accessible for those who may be faster or slower readers. Lastly, I have an example of a wheelchair accessible entrance, which Tiffany alluded to in the prior segment, where you have to go around the back to access the building. And you may be wondering why I know that this is the wheelchair accessible entrance. Well, if we zoom in here, there's a tiny sign indicating that this is the direction you should be going. This is very clear. This has been an accommodation. Whereas the staircase that has integrated switchbacks caters to all, including those with sight impairments, by having railings to guide them. So I've gone over some very specific examples here, but I want to zoom back out again and reiterate 2 questions that you should be asking yourself when trying to achieve mainstreaming. Are the needs of individuals being included from the beginning? And have the needs of individuals been fully integrated? Another thing I want to touch on here is the question of what can we do about spaces that already exist? How can we possibly make spaces that have failed to meet the needs of individuals achieve mainstreaming? And I'm going to back up to the example of level boarding. As I mentioned previously, there are only small portions of the platform that have level boarding. Some may argue that costs and the construction inconvenience of making the entire platform level boarding are the reasons why there are only small portions. But my bet is they just did not involve enough of those needing level boarding into their planning process. If you cannot answer the first question affirmatively, then it should be your goal to answer the second question affirmatively. So now that we've learned the so we're about to have an interactive exercise, but before we start that, I want to go over a few things to think about during the exercise. Remember these 6 senses of the built environment: sight, sound, security, access, comfort, and enjoyment. A lot of these are going to go hand in hand. For instance, access and sound. Someone who is visually impaired may be needed to be guided by crossing chirps in order to access a space. I also recognize that these last 2 are very subjective senses, so try your best to consider how someone other than yourself might view these spaces in terms of comfort and enjoyment. So now that you've learned some differences and kind of started to think about ways in which spaces meet the needs of people or the ways they do not, we're going to do this exercise. So if you could go to menti.com, there should also be a link in the chat that you can press. And you can either copy paste the code from the chat or enter the code here, 6365417. And I'll give everyone about 30 seconds or so to situate themselves. All right, so before we begin, I'll just go over these few bullet points. So the following slides are going to ask what elements of inclusion are either present or missing from the space. And by elements of inclusion, I mean features in the built environment that meet needs of individuals. And remember, not all elements are going to be visually present, or it might be hard to tell because this is just one frame of the picture. But try your best to think outside the box and really, dig into these spaces. If you give me some thumbs up, I see loads of people are giving me thumbs up, seeing that people are joining. And I will kick it off. So what elements of inclusion are present in this location?
And Katie, if I can just offer one cue. So in the link that you followed on your screen, you should see some opportunities to interact with what you see on Katie's screen. So add your input in your new web browser that you just opened, and then look for that feedback to appear on Katie's screen here in Zoom.
I don't know if I want to do, we can do a little countdown, or let's test it out and see what works best. So I'll go ahead and well, I don't want to reveal I don't want to take down the picture quite yet because people are probably still looking at it, but I'll give people, let's say 10 more seconds to get your answers in. And there's a few of these, so if you don't get the chance quite right off the bat, you'll have more opportunities. So what is present? What's working in this space? All right, let's see what we said. So two of the biggest things people are noticing is seating and lighting, which is great. I actually hadn't really noticed the lighting, so you've even bested me. The bike racks, also very good, pick up on that, and they're well integrated with the bollards. I see the bollards are on there as well, so that's that sense of security, because that picture, I'll flip back to the picture real quick, is actually taken from the road. So it looks very seamless between the road and the pedestrianized space. Those bollards are in place so that drivers aren't confused. Let's see what I have from my notes. Do we have bins? Someone brought up bins. That's another thing I noticed, that those are present, so it keeps the space clean, or helps people feel like they're not having to hold on to anything or feel bad about putting something down, put an empty coffee cup down or something. Do we have trees or greenery? So a little bit, some people have mentioned the trees, so that's another good element of this. Trees can provide cover. Those trees are still a little bit young, so they probably don't provide much cover now, but the intention is still there. So I think we started off on a strong foot. Congrats, everyone. So the next one, it's the same space. So this time, I want you to think about what's missing. This is, I originally wasn't going to do missing because I felt like the space did such a good job. But the more I thought about it, there are some elements missing here. So really dive deep and try to think about the things that maybe this space isn't quite hitting the mark on. And I'll give people about 30 seconds to get their answers in. And you should be able to submit multiple times. So if you think of something afterwards, keep entering till time runs out. I'll give people 10 more seconds. All right. Signage, wayfinding. Interesting. There is signage in wayfinding, but that's okay. It is a bit, I'll flash back real quick. There's some signage present right here. But what else we have? Shade, yes, so I touched on that a little bit. The trees are there, but they're not quite up to snuff yet. So you're absolutely right about the cover. Vibrancy. So this is one of the things that touches more on the comfort and enjoyment. I think a lot of times you miss out on the art or the color or the culture of places. I have another one yet, but I don't want to get into it until we see the other pictures to give it away. Emergency phone, that's another thing I thought of. I know on my undergraduate campus, we had the blue lights, and that's the only place I can really think of that has that infrastructure. And for me, as a woman, I mean, I do have a very specific lens, but I know as a woman, I won't necessarily go out after a certain time because there might not be those infrastructure elements in place to make me feel safe or a sense of security. Seating with arms. I find that one interesting. I did think about that a little bit. I also think seating with arms can sometimes inhibit people's needs as well. We all can't think of the term right now. Aggressive design elements or something like that, where there's these elements that are meant to deter rough sleepers or homelessness from lying down or being able to use a space how they may need it. And it's something for kids. So yes, touching on that play and that vibrancy. Oh, and I'll go back real quick. I forgot to mention, so this is in Bromley, UK, and I swear this is my only UK example. So now we got Littleton. I actually just went down to the riverfront and snapped these yesterday. And I'll give you guys maybe 30 seconds, see how we are at that point. So what's missing from this public space? And the rest of these are all gonna be what's missing, because now we've had a compare and contrast of a single place. Let's just focus on what's missing. How is it not meeting the needs of people? I'll give people a little bit more time. That timer goes down fast. And feel free to write in the chat box if you think I'm going too fast. It'll let me know. Hostile design. You're correct, James. That's exactly what I was thinking of. All right, so what's missing? Shade, signage. Yes, these are things I picked up as well. Wheelchair space at the table, absolutely. I was really trying to dig deep into this space, and I feel like they had the good intentions there with the slab underneath the table to be able to allow easier access. But the table still doesn't really meet that need of someone who might want to have a picnic or just stop and hang out with friends. Wider sidewalks, absolutely. Very high curbs. That's another thing, which you could say it's to deter cars from driving up on the sidewalks. So that's really, you gotta fit what works with the area, but absolutely, I think those curbs are too high. Visually impaired clues, absolutely. Dying veg, I mean, it is almost October, but yes. What else do we have? I think we hit a lot of the good, a lot of on the same things that I had thought of. Yep. Sorry, it takes me a little time to read all of them, because if they're only slightly different answers, they won't group them together. So what elements of inclusion are missing from this public space? And this is in Burlington. Megan actually helped me out with this picture, gave me some ideas. So yeah, I'll give you guys, I'll do a minute this time because it seems like I end up doing a minute anyways. And this is our last one too, so if you want to get in your answers now, this is your last chance. All right. Shade and seating. These are two of the biggest things. I think I'll flip back to the picture real quick. The two people here huddling just into the shade is just a really good indicator of how this space is lacking. And also, I'll see if someone typed it in. Signage. So the other thing, they're standing there and they're looking down on their phone. I'm assuming they're looking at Google Maps because they don't know where they're going because there's no wayfinding or signage to help them know where they need to go or where they are. Bikes, no infrastructure for bikes, no lanes, no parking. Refuge island, that's another good one. That's one I hadn't necessarily thought of. So I'll switch back again real quick. So that crossing that length might be a bit too long for some people and it might be better to phase it. Bins, yep, greenery, benches. Yeah, very, very good. All good stuff. Awesome. Well, thanks for joining me in on that exercise. I hope that was fun and woke some people up if my presentation wasn't too exciting. I only have 2 more slides and then we'll get into any questions or discussions that attendees may want to do. So how do we move towards mainstreaming? Like I said, G and Tiffany touched on a lot of the same things I'll touch on. So the main thing to remember that it's a strategy. It's not necessarily just one thing that you can do. And similar how you would make a complete street strategy, it involves policy change, it involves culture evaluations, implementation plans, and practice. So the policy change would relate to your workplace, your organization, or community, how it's dictated. So do your policies reflect that of the goals of mainstreaming? And going off of that, does your workplace and social life have a culture that supports mainstreaming? And what I mean by this is, how are things done around here? Are the unwritten rules in your life and workplace, as well as attitudes, match the goals of mainstreaming? As well, we know if policies don't have implementation plans, they'll just kind of be put up on a shelf and forgotten about. And lastly, practice. You're not going to get it right on the first try. There's always going to be new things, research, ways life changes. So just keep practicing. Lastly, I have some personal actions. So some of those questions during the keynote, a lot of you are really interested in what can I do right now? I've got a few things for you, and some of them are the same that have already been mentioned. So first thing, you can sit down and critically think about who is missing and why. And this is twofold. So who's missing from the planning process and who's also missing from the users of a space. And it may sound counterintuitive to center around individual experiences, since mainstreaming is all about normalizing everyone. However, focusing on improving the participation and experiences of those currently being left out is the way you can move towards mainstreaming. The next is to diversify the content you consume. This includes social media, literature, audiobooks, podcasts, whatever else that you consume. And I myself, over the last few months, have been following a greater diversity of races, cultures, religions, abilities on my social media platforms, as well as in the type of podcasts I listen. I'm a huge podcast person. I've always got something going. And I've noticed a change in the way that I look at the world outside of my own bubble. And I really encourage you guys to do some of this. Another thing you can do is to try to find opportunities to put yourself in someone else's shoes. So for instance, yesterday, I was preparing my notes and I was kind of thinking, you know, what can I do differently? What can I do today to make put myself in a comfortable position, but for someone else, it's their everyday reality. So I had a doctor's appointment. My doctor's office is about 3.5 miles away from my house. I thought I could bike it. It's a nice day. And I was going to bike it, but I called ahead to make sure they had cycle parking. Oops. And they didn't. So I didn't end up bicycling because I didn't have a place to securely lock up my bike. And even if they had bicycle parking, I would have had to allot 40 extra minutes into my day to be able to get to my appointment on time. So even if you don't put yourself through the motion, like I didn't actually go and bicycle to my appointment, it still made me stop and think about the ways in which others have to plan, miss out on, or lose time as they move through their world. And you can really start to see where needs are not being met. You can also volunteer to become your workplace's mainstreaming champion. This means you take on the role of making your workplace and the work that you do more aligned with the goals of mainstreaming. And as G mentioned, maybe you take a look at the recruiting processes. Do the questions meet the goals of mainstreaming? And lastly, vote. Candidates from local to national levels have an impact on how policies and programs will affect the goals of mainstreaming. Research candidates' plans and decide who's most aligned with the goals of mainstreaming and vote for them. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Katie. So we do have a little bit of time for some questions. If anybody else would like to share a question for Katie in the Q&A box. Before we get into the question that we do have right now, I wanted to share a quick observation that I had, Katie, which again is kind of building off of what we heard in our keynote and exploring that kind of through what you've shared with us. I think one of the strengths of the work that you did in evaluating the PTAL in London was that you were really following that advice that Tiffany shared with us a couple of times, which is to question the question. You know, look at what is the rubric that we're using in evaluating our plans, our process, our built environment through, and figuring out, you know, what is the question that we're actually not asking, or what are some of the shortcomings of that system. And I think that we also, when we talk about and when we participate in exercises like the one that you just walked us through, I think we also have to think about those lenses that we bring. I know that sitting here, I was kind of laughing at how many more responses there were to the image of Burlington than to some of the others, which makes me wonder. But
I almost said something.
it can be easy, I guess, to think this is easy. This is an easy answer. This is something that we as planners that are trained to see the shortcomings of this really wide main street, it's easy to pick out what's wrong with this situation. But we may have missed some of those experiences that we just don't share with others, like what actually would make you feel more safe or more comfortable or more welcome in that space. And so I really like that, and you briefly mentioned it, and I want to just reiterate it, the Inclusive Design Toolkit that really helps people think about, multiple dimensions, from kind of permanent needs to situational needs. And we did share this in the resource guide that was mentioned a couple of times in the keynote as well, that it's really good for us to think about as planners that the easy answers aren't always the obvious ones. And sometimes we have to dig a little deeper and question, what's the rubric we're using to kind of answer those questions. So it's more of an observation that I had than a question for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the question, we have a couple questions here. So the first one I'm going to go to is, what are your thoughts about mainstreaming benefits, which are beyond just specific target issues? So, we've mentioned, physical accessibility, but what other benefits can communities or public spaces realize by mainstreaming or incorporating mainstreaming into our work?
I think one thing to think about is you're kind of future-proofing the space. So it may not necessarily, we may not know all the needs of people right now that are in the future, but by trying to do the best you can and incorporating things that you may say, oh, that's not ever really going to be used, it's still there. It's a future-proofing of sorts. Kind of like with the which element was it that I was thinking of? I forgot my train of thought, but there was a certain aspect in the presentation where it was very much a future. Oh, my brief mention of our aging population. So putting that infrastructure in now will help us in the future, and I think that's also what it's about. And overall, making that comfort and enjoyment for people is a big one, and it can kind of be lost because it's such it's a smoky thing. It's not necessarily something that you can specifically point to. It's very subjective, but by having spaces that make people feel included, you're making them more comfortable and enjoyable.
There's a couple people that are interested in hearing a little bit more about how conventional bike lanes work in London. Specifically the painted strips on the roadway. Do you know, are there pretty notable differences between how they function there versus how you've seen them implemented in communities that you've worked in the US?
So conventional lane as in like the fully painted, like the color difference lane?
Maybe just like with a line striping, just a
okay, some sort of better than a Shero, basically.
Right.
I think, it gives someone the space, which London is a particular location because there are a lot of the black cabs, and I've personally had some run-ins with them. They really don't care regardless if there's bike lane there or not. But I think those lanes, they're starting to build this network of cycle superhighways. And I think they have some of those in New York City now too, where they're not fully segregated, but they do have a very clear delineation between the road and the bike lane. And I think those are really the best options. But I also feel like the more that people feel comfortable on the bike, so having those spaces, even if it's just a painted line, helps build that culture to make more people come out. And it just creates an environment where it's expected and it's normal. Again, back to this normal is really the goal. And yeah, it's a work in progress, I'll say that.
Thank you. So we have a couple questions here. One is about what you talked about before, about maybe being a champion, and the fact that mainstreaming not only includes policy, but also culture. And the question is specifically about, how we overcome apathy towards mainstreaming. This person shared that they, have experienced that being a champion can have limited success if you live in a society that hasn't bought into that value. So do you have any other thoughts about in addition to the other tips that you shared with us about what we can do personally, about maybe how we as planners can do work that maybe inspires people to value mainstreaming?
I would say the best tool is to use those temporary and situational examples. Um, and one of my accounts that I recently started following on Instagram, and they focus on raising issues about people with disabilities, specifically physical disabilities, that the average of how do I word this? The average of years of disability for everyone is around 8 to 10 years. So that means all of us will experience disability in our lives about 8 to 10 years out of our lives, which most people, that's probably when they're older, but regardless, it's still there. So if you can get people to think about how these changes could affect them, a lot of us admittedly are probably a little bit selfish. So when we can relate it to how we would feel and how it would affect us personally, you know, I think that would really help. So you could point out, if you broke your leg and had to be in a wheelchair for a couple months, how would you be able to use this space? And how would that affect your life?
Right. That's kind of what you're saying about, you know, looking at this from the lens of another person's experiences, or maybe in that case, potentially your own experience, just not your present one. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We have a question here that's asking, you mentioned some of the things that you've been doing, people you've been following on social media, podcasts that you've been listening to. Do you have any recommendations about either podcasts, websites, Instagram accounts, something that you've found particularly helpful regarding perspectives of people with differing abilities? You just mentioned that you've been listening to one.
Yeah, I'll see if I can find the account name right now. But for podcasts, I've got loads. I listen, and these are probably ones you may have heard before, but I listen to NPR's Code Switch, which is fantastic podcast. Crooked Media also has a podcast called Pod Save the People, which is really good, and it's all about people of color getting together and talking about either events that kind of fly under the radar because they're not as spectacular but still really matter, or the ways in which these really popular topics affect people differently than how you may think yourself. And there's the last one I listened to is, I have to think about it.
Katie, one I might offer also is a podcast called 99% Invisible,
Yes.
which often looks at these sort of hidden issues that specifically are related to design, which is often has really fantastic content too.
Yeah, the Instagram account I call is called Pacing Pixie. And I think it's actually based in the UK, so maybe some of the statistics will be UK based. But I found from looking at disability numbers from between countries, it's not too dissimilar. So you're still able to gain a lot, even though it might not necessarily be, you know, from the American Community Survey.
Great. Okay, so the last question then, somebody asked if England has an equivalent of the US's ADA law, and might that change some of the attitudes and funding between the US and UK?
Yes, they do have an ADA law. If I'm remembering correctly, it is the DDA, Disability Discrimination Act. They also have an Equality Act that was passed in 2010. Similar to, what is it, our EA here, we have an Equality Act that's, it's getting there. So both of those, both these policies are really instrumental in making sure that private businesses, public businesses, developers, everyone, it has some guidance, and they have to meet certain criteria. And, you know, you could debate on whether that's good or not, because some people, they'll just hit the mark but not go any further. But overall, I think having something like an Equality Act is really important, because that just, it includes everyone, and there's not necessarily you know, a specific act for a specific portion of people. So again, that's kind of like the calling out a certain group. To an extent, it is important to achieve mainstreaming, but we want to get to a place where we don't have to call out certain groups.
Right. We want to get from accommodation to mainstreaming, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Katie, as you mentioned from participating in your activity, time really does go fast on Zoom, and we are at the end of this session. So I just want to say thank you for taking the time to share your research and give us something additional to think about as, you know, kind of narrowing some of the topics that we really heard about in our keynote to make us think about things on the ground and kind of in our day-to-day work. And, you know, really appreciate you also engaging us in your session and allowing us to participate that way. So we are going to go into a 15-minute break at this point, and when we come back, we will be hearing from Ivy Van about something that she calls the Dirty Dozen, which I'm sure will be very provocative in terms of thinking about how we do zoning differently. So thanks again, Katie, and we will see you all at 2:45.